Paige went outside, she wanted at least a little break from other people's fates. Because sometimes it was very hard to tell a person what you see and to look into eyes full of hope. So Paige never told the truth if she saw something bad, but simply said she saw nothing. Some would curse and shout, and there were those who understood everything and left in silence. Outside the house, Paige unexpectedly ran into a neighbor, a very active woman in the neighborhood. In her younger years, she used to sing and act in the theater, but now, having retired, she could not sit still in one place and was constantly engaged in public life, as well as help children and the elderly, organize charity concerts for them. Therefore, everyone loved and respected Mrs. Martinez very much. Paige said hello to her, and Mrs. Martinez once again asked Paige when she would read her fortune. Paige smiled. "Well, why do you need it? You are living a full life. Your children are smart and healthy. Your husband is alive and healthy, and he is still in love with you. Oh, you think so? But I have 3 celebrations ahead of me. What if I die accidentally?" Mrs. Martinez winked conspiratorially. Paige laughed at this cheerful woman with great energy. "Stop it," she said. "You will organize many more holidays and concerts for sure." And then Mrs. Martinez suddenly became serious and said, "Paige, darling, I have a favor to ask of you. A young man who looks about 20 years old showed up at the home for the disabled, where I often visit. He can't walk since childhood and doesn't remember anything about his parents. He may have some kind of trauma, but he wants to know something about himself, to have hope. Do you want me to read his fortune?" "Yes," Paige replied. "I told him about you. He doesn't believe in all of those things, of course, but he thought about it and decided it was better than nothing at all." "All right, let me go with you tomorrow," Paige agreed and smiled. And at night, she had the same nightmare as she had had all these years. Again, she saw her grandmother laughing madly, grabbing Paige's little son Ben and throwing him into the rushing mountain river. It happened when the boy was just 3 years old. They searched for them for a long time, combing every meter along the river, but the search came to nothing. The bodies were not found. Paige was 25 years old at the time and had gone completely gray that day. But this story began much earlier. Paige's grandmother, who raised her, had always been strange. She was disliked and feared in the village and considered almost a witch. Paige was also afraid of her because she kept telling the girl that she would eventually pass her talent to her. This scared Paige. She didn't want to do it, and she dreamed of a normal life, a husband, and children. But her grandmother believed that Paige was not destined for a family and should be a successor of the dynasty, and they often quarreled on this ground. So when the girl was 15 and her grandmother had already started making her learn some weird texts, Paige was determined to run away. And at 17, she did just that, because she didn't want to become like her grandmother. Paige pursued a career as a hairdresser, got a job, and met a nice young man whom she eventually married. Soon they had a son named Ben. It seemed like life was getting better, but Paige was worried about leaving her elderly grandmother alone. So, after consulting with her husband, they decided to visit her and possibly take her to the city. When they arrived in the village, the grandmother was happy to see them. Everything was quiet and there were no signs of danger. However, in the evening, when they all went for a walk along the river, the older woman brought up the topic of Paige's destiny once again. "Paige, I'm about to leave this world, and you must accept my talent." "You have no choice," she said. "No, I have always told you that I don't want to and won't do it," replied Paige firmly. After these words, the grandmother suddenly stopped, looked intently into Paige's eyes, and then laughed madly. She grabbed little Ben and sharply pushed Paige away before jumping off the cliff. Paige rushed towards them, ready to throw herself into the abyss, but her husband Ashton ran up and held her back. For the next 2 years, Paige tried to end her life several times, but doctors saved her. One day, a gypsy woman approached her on the street. She looked into Paige's eyes and said, "You should not try to go to the other world because you are still needed here." Shocked, Paige asked who needed her here. Since her son had died and her husband had left, the gypsy looked at Paige's hand and, saying that Paige was totally wrong, disappeared into the crowd. Paige froze. When she looked at the hand the gypsy was holding, she realized that the lines on her hand seemed to want to tell her something, but she didn't understand what. For 5 years, Paige has been learning to read the lines of fate, trying not to think that her grandmother had given her this skill. At first, Paige practiced on her neighbors, who, seeing how accurately Paige predicted everything, told their acquaintances about her, and even began to visit her from other cities. Paige's predictions were always accurate, but she could not read her own destiny. She knew from ancient books that it was a peculiarity. She could never read her own hand or the hand of a close relative. Paige shivered at the memory that came back to her. She got up and went to the kitchen. She usually couldn't fall asleep after that nightmare, so Paige made herself some tea, opened a book, and she woke up with a sharp pain in her neck. Glancing at her watch, she was surprised to see that she had slept for 2 whole hours. This seemed strange to her, but she decided to think about it later. For now, she had to get ready for visiting the residential care home. A little later in the morning, Paige met Mrs. Martinez outside and offered to stop at the store on her way to buy some presents for the people who lived there. Mrs. Martinez was so grateful to Paige that she agreed to read the fortune of a poor young man, and when she heard about her intentions to bring these people presents, she was finally convinced of what a good heart Paige had. They hailed a cab, sat down, and were just about to talk about something when the cab driver turned to them, and Paige thought she was going to faint. It was Ashton, her ex-husband. Before he left, he said, "I would never leave you. We have grief in common. But what you're doing now when you're trying to commit suicide is wild to me. If I am next to a mad woman who does not think that there are other people around, you only think about yourself." And now Ashton was looking at Paige with wonder too. Then he complimented her in a casual tone, telling her that she looked great. They exchanged a few more words, but they were silent most of the way. When they arrived at the place, Ashton helped unload the presents and promised that he would not leave and wait for them. At the nursing home, Paige walked down the corridor, following Mrs. Martinez, and thought about Ashton's words. They entered one of the rooms, and for some reason, Paige immediately realized who she was talking about. Although there were many people in wheelchairs, only one man had such a tenacious and serious look. The women arranged the gifts, and while everyone was happily sorting it out, Paige approached the young man and asked his name. "Charlie," he replied. "Are you the fortune teller who knows everything about everyone?" "No, I'm just an ordinary person. I just learned to read lines a long time ago. Shall we give it a try?" Charlie smiled. "Just please, if you see something bad, don't tell me. Tell me if it's okay so I'll have the will to live." Paige felt sorry for the guy. "Tell me, do you have any relatives?" "No, not one. I was dropped off at the hospital door a long time ago, and the doctors told me that if I had been treated right after my injuries, I might have been able to walk. And my parents apparently tried to treat me on their own, but when they realized it wasn't working, they left me because I was a burden to them." Paige scrutinized the young man, feeling his pain and frustration perfectly. "But you don't know for sure. Maybe your parents had nothing to do with it. Maybe you were stolen in the first place. Yeah, it's unlikely, but everything in the world is possible. So are you ready?" Charlie held out his hand. Paige took it and froze. A coldness was rising from somewhere inside. She could see nothing, as if she were looking at her own hand. Paige felt like she was about to faint and rushed to run, and Mrs. Martinez rushed after her, not understanding what had happened. And Charlie, he felt something that made him want to cry. Jumping out into the street, Paige found herself in Ashton's arms and burst into tears. "Paige, what's wrong with you?" Frightened, Ashton asked, trying to calm her down. "Ashton, there's Ben. Our Ben." Ashton opened his arms, and Paige almost fell over. "Are you crazy?" Mrs. Martinez, on the other hand, froze in shock and looked at Ashton and the young man in a wheelchair. They had just arrived at the porch with the other personnel who were running out to the noise. Suddenly, she understood everything. Charlie was a copy of Ashton in his youth, and the resemblance was striking. Upset, Charlie tried to go back to his room, but Paige rushed to him with a desperate cry. "Stop! It's not what you think. Then she told him everything. It was likely that after her grandmother's terrible act, Charlie was washed up on some shore. No one knows how long he lay there, but some strangers found him. Why strangers? Because all the locals knew about the misfortune that had happened. Maybe they were gypsies or vagrants. When they realized the child was traumatized, they dropped him off near the hospital. That's why the search on the river was inconclusive. 2 years had passed when a car pulled up to Paige's house. Ashton got out of it and helped Charlie, who was now Ben again. 2 months ago he had surgery, and today, on his mother's birthday, he wanted to surprise her. Ashton handed his son a bouquet and was about to leave. Dad, what about you? Aren't you coming? Oh, I'll congratulate Mom on the phone. I don't think she'll be happy to see me. Dad, you're both like little kids, honestly. And then it's hard for me to go alone with all this. Ashton smiled at his son's slyness. All right, but if she gets me down the stairs, it's your fault. Meanwhile, Mrs. Martinez was sitting on the terrace of the neighboring house, watching the scene and wiping away her tears. She knew exactly how Paige was waiting for them and how she would weep with joy when she saw them both. After all, the woman had suffered so much grief and she deserved her happiness.